Certainly. It's the most famous name in the Japanese Navy during World War II, and today it's basically a pop culture reference. The super battleship Yamato. Let's finally talk about the history of this ship. So get ready to dive into history. First of all, I think it's necessary for us to clarify what the term battleship means, but not just talk about the word itself. You know that the word itself refers to armor, which actually means protection. But any warship from that time had some kind of armor. So the fact that battleships were armored isn't exactly the most effective point for us to explain the reason for their existence. For us to understand this, we need to understand 19th century naval warfare, which in recent times was really the century that most developed naval technology from its beginning to its end. We just have to remember that at the beginning of the 19th century, war was still fought with sailing ships, basically ships powered by the wind. And during that century, steam propulsion was invented, right? First with coal and finally, in the end, internal combustion propulsion. Ships actually powered by oil. So, throughout the 19th century, ships also went from being wooden vessels to becoming supergiants made of increasingly dense steel. And at the top of this development, which includes the first examples of what we now know as destroyers and cruisers, and which culminated with the battleships, which is the Portuguese term for battleship, which I personally think is much more representative as it means battleship. The battleship then should be the biggest of all, the most armored of all. And it basically serves as a large floating gun platform, capable of destroying any kind of opponent. Everything else in the construction of a battleship is complementary to its main firepower. So if you have a ship with such great firepower, you need to have a very large structure that provides stability for that kind of shooting. You'll also draw much more attention to yourself if you have that kind of firepower, so it's quite possible that you'll need to have very strong armor to withstand those attacks. And then all this evolution culminates in 1906 with the launch of His Majesty's ship Dreadnought over in England, which becomes the final standard, let's say. The standard we know today as the battleship. And the Yamato was the largest of these battleships in all of history. And the story of the Yamato actually begins back at the very start of the 1930s, when the Japanese government took on that more militaristic and expansionist face that we know well. After invading Manchuria in 1931, Japan began to receive various accusations in the international organizations of the time, especially from the League of Nations. Many nations pressured Japan to end its ongoing war against China. So Japan simply decided to leave the League of Nations in 1934. Shortly after, Japan also withdrew from the Washington Naval Treaty, which was a treaty that Japan itself had signed, which limited the weight and firepower of battleships. So outside of this treaty, having basically torn up that agreement, Japan became completely autonomous in the decisions it could make regarding its own naval construction. And that's exactly when they decide to move forward with a rather bold idea. The justification given by a group of high-ranking officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy is that Japan will never be able to compete directly with the economic potential, the shipbuilding potential of the United States. In other words, the Japanese Navy will not achieve, in the medium or even the long term, naval parity with the major forces of the American Navy. So it would be better to build a class of super battleships, ships that are really much larger and more powerful than the average battleships of that time, so that these super battleships could engage and defeat multiple other smaller battleships in battle at the same time. A project like this costs a lot of money, but imagine, a lot of money indeed. But by the late 1930s, the Japanese Navy had much more prestige with the government than the Japanese Army. This was because Japan's eyes were really turned to the south, to the Pacific area, and the riches contained in the European colonies located there, and which of the two forces could lead Japan to conquer those colonies. Of course, it was the Navy. And in this way, the Navy did get all the budget it wanted to build its super battleships. It's worth mentioning that at the same time they were pursuing these super battleships, the Navy was building multiple aircraft carriers. And with these aircraft carriers, it's another example of the much looser budget that the Navy had compared to the Army. They were developing their super fighter, which was the Model 40, right? The Mitsubishi A6M0, whose full story you can check out in this video of ours here. So, the Kure Naval Arsenal, right near Hiroshima, was chosen as the place for the construction and assembly of these super battleships. The entire process was conducted in strict secrecy, top secret. So in general, nobody knew that on November 4th, 1937, the keel of Yamato was laid down. In other words, its construction was started. The Yamato's construction dock even had to be expanded at the beginning of the process to handle such a large ship. And later, when the superstructure was already starting to be assembled, the government even put up a kind of visual barrier, a large screen, to prevent the curiosity of people passing by. And that's how, on August 8, 1940, Yamato was launched into the sea. Now, I want to show you this keychain here that my friend Giuliano Lillo brought me last year when he visited the Yamato Museum in Kure. Look how beautiful it is, and on the back it has the launch date of Yamato, August 8th, 1940. On top, 8815. 15 actually refers to the Japanese calendar for the Showa era. In other words, 15 years since the coronation of Emperor Hirohito, which happened in 1926. Before we continue, another clarification is needed, because it's been a long time since I published my video about Bismarck. If you haven't seen it yet, just click here to watch it. And in that video, I say that Bismarck was the biggest battleship of its time. And yes, I'm not wrong. Bismarck was the biggest battleship of its time. Because when Bismarck was already at sea, already operating, Yamato was still under construction. It hadn't been commissioned into service yet. So, if anything had gone wrong during Yamato's construction, Yamato simply would never have gone into operation. What does that make Bismarck? Until the act of its sinking in May of 1941, it was indeed the largest battleship of its time. But meanwhile, while everything was happening over in Europe, back in Japan, the Yamato was in the water, being assembled, receiving its final construction. And the Yamato was truly impressive with its 71,000 tons of weight. Imagine 71,000 tons. It measured 263 meters in length, and it had a main armament consisting of 9 Type 94 guns with an impressive caliber of 460 millimeters, meaning they fired shells that were about 46 centimeters in diameter. Each of these guns was 21 meters long and weighed 147 tons. Just one gun weighed 147 tons. The accuracy of Yamato's main batteries reached up to 42 kilometers, firing both high explosive shells and armor-piercing shells. Yamato's secondary armament was also quite impressive, with 12 155mm guns in 4 triple turrets, meaning each turret had 3 guns. And there was also a tertiary armament as well, consisting of 12 127mm guns in 6 twin turrets. The ship's anti-aircraft protection was provided by 24 25mm automatic guns. And what about the ship's armor? After all, it's a battleship, right? So the Yamato's armor at the waterline, that is, where enemy torpedoes could hit most often, it was made of 410 millimeters, that is, about 41 centimeters of pure steel, surrounded the ship at the waterline. The Yamato's deck, that is, its anti-bomb protection, bombs coming from above, was made of 22 centimeters of pure steel. And the armor on Yamato's gun turrets reached an impressive 65 centimeters of steel. For aerial reconnaissance, the Yamato carried 7 Nakajima E-8N aircraft, and it could reach a speed of 27 knots, which is approximately 50 kilometers per hour, with a crew made up of no less than 3,233 men. In November 1941, just a few days before Japan began its offensive, with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, the Yamato began its sea trials. And just about a week after Japan went to war, just about a week after the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 16, 1941, the Yamato was finally commissioned there at the Kure Naval Arsenal near Hiroshima in a rather simple ceremony, very secretive, no celebration, no public present. It was really something very secretive. And then on February 12, 1942, the Yamato became the flagship of the Japanese Combined Fleet under the direct command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the chief strategist of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At that moment, Yamamoto already foresaw the need for a major naval battle, a decisive confrontation against the United States Navy to firmly establish Japanese supremacy in the Pacific. And from that point on, he began to devise a trap to lure what was left of the United States Navy into a decisive battle around the island of Midway in the middle of the Pacific, which the Japanese would capture, thus drawing in this American resistance, which would then be hammered to destruction by the Imperial Navy. The main attack force in this battle would be the Kido Butai, the elite aircraft carrier squadron that at the time was commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. But Yamamoto himself would be the overall commander of the operation, following in the rearmost detachment, which would be led by the Yamato itself. Yamamoto's strategy of separating the two contingents initially aimed to create a double surprise for the Americans. They would not only have to face the Kido Butai, but also his battleship division, which would follow afterwards. And on May 27th, that's what happened. Yamamoto set sail for Midway aboard the Yamato. But on June 4th, 1942, when the Battle of Midway took place, which I must say started out quite favorably for the Japanese, it ended up turning completely against them due to a great stroke of luck by Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bomber squadron, which spotted the carriers when their planes were low on fuel and carried out a dive bombing attack, sinking 3 of them at once. Later, the 4th and last Japanese aircraft carrier was also sunk, and Yamamoto was still 300 kilometers away on the bridge of the Yamato when he received this news. Yamamoto then, fearing for the safety of the Yamato against those American carrier aircraft, decided to turn back and return to Japan. This decision by Yamamoto, of course, was influenced by the sinking of the Bismarck in May 1941, which happened precisely because of British carrier aircraft. So Yamamoto was afraid of losing what was already at that time the greatest symbol of Japanese military power, the Yamato. We have to explain this to you since you might not know the origin of the name Yamato. Yamato is a Japanese province. But also, look, it's kind of a poetic name for Japan itself. And the Japanese imperial house, which has been in power continuously for more than 2,000 years, is also known as the Yamato House, or House of Yamato. So, actually, for the Japanese, the battleship Yamato is kind of a reflection of their own entity, of their own civilizational identity. And this explains the fascination that the average Japanese person has with the battleship Yamato to this day. That said, for the next 2 years, the Yamato will basically remain in the rear, in the shadows, carrying out transits between the Curie Naval Base over in Japan and the Truk Lagoon Naval Base in the South Pacific, which was the largest base of the Imperial Japanese Navy in that area of the South Pacific. By the way, this base was taken from the Germans after World War I, after Japan, which was part of the Allied nations, gained this part of the Caroline Islands as war reparations. The Yamato and its sister ship, the Musashi, which was another battleship of the same class. I'm not sure if you knew, but yes, there was a twin brother of the Yamato called Musashi. They were then assigned to the 1st Battleship Division, based there in Truk. And during all that time, the Yamato and the Musashi were used in operations to try to inhibit actions by the United States Navy in that region. And they were also used, believe it or not, as transports. Since both ships really had a large cargo capacity, they were used as logistical means to supply various Japanese garrisons throughout the South Pacific. And on one of these missions, when Yamato was returning to Truk on December the 25th, 1943, he was hit by a torpedo from the American submarine United States ship's gate. And this torpedo from the skate then struck near the bow of Yamato and made a really large hole there, which wasn't enough, of course, to sink the ship. Not even close, but obviously this kind of damage had to be repaired. When the ship then arrived at Truk a few days later, it only received some temporary repairs there, right? Really just a patch so the ship wouldn't take on more water. And immediately it had to return to Japan to undergo permanent repairs. Then between February and March of 1944, Yamato entered the dry dock at the Kure base. And then besides the permanent patch for the damage caused by the skate's torpedo near the bow of the ship, it underwent a complete overhaul and rearmament. Yamato's secondary armament, that is, its 155 mm and 127 mm turrets, were reduced to make room for a massive expansion of its anti-aircraft capability. Just so you have an idea, from 24 25 mm anti-aircraft guns, Yamato came to carry 162 guns of the same caliber. In other words, its anti-aircraft protection became about 6 times more powerful. At the same time, Yamato's radars were also upgraded. That's right, you heard it, radars. Yamato had radars at the time. We usually think that only the British had radar. Because of that myth about the Battle of Britain, that only the British had radar, that it was their big innovation. But not the main countries of World War II. All the major powers had radar, and Japan was no exception. In fact, in that modification, Yamato received a new Type 13 air search radar, and also a new surface radar, and also a Type 22 fire control radar. In fact, one of the survivors of the sinking of Yamato in 1945, one of the few survivors, right, was actually the ship's radar operator, Mitsuru Yoshida, who wrote his memoirs. And through these memoirs, we get to know in more detail what happened during the ship's final moments of resistance on the surface. On May 14th, when its renovation was already complete, Yamato then set sail for the Philippines, where it became part of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's so-called mobile fleet. And Yamato was ready to intervene in the American landing operation on Biak Island over in New Guinea when the Japanese received information that the American fleet was approaching the Marianas in the Central Pacific. So, starting on June 19th, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea took place. Right there, near the Marianas, which the Americans know as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In this confrontation, the Americans shot down about 300 Japanese fighters and also sank 3 more aircraft carriers. And in this battle, although Yamato was officially included in the action, it did not actually participate, staying far from the combat zone. The shock of the defeat in the Battle of the Philippine Sea was very great in Japan, so much so that Yamato returned once again to Kure, where it underwent another renovation. And this time they removed everything flammable from the ship. And they also increased the fire brigade equipment on the ship itself. Just so you know, they even removed the mattresses from the ship, and the sailors started sleeping on metal sheets, which could even be used as emergency patches in case the hull or internal compartments were punctured. So on July 17, 1944, Yamato then set sail south, once again arriving at the Linga Islands there in the Dutch East Indies to stay closer to the Japanese fuel production area. That's because at that time, American submarines were already acting very aggressively against Japanese oil tankers. So the fuel supply in Japan was getting really low. So they sent the Yamato to be based there, close to the East Indies, because that's where the fuel Japan used was produced. And it was in this context that the largest naval battle in history happened, which was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which occurred from October 22 to 25, 1944. It was in this battle, actually, in a clash near the island of Samar on October 24, 1944, that Yamato would have its first and only chance to open fire with its main guns in combat against surface targets. When American Admiral Bull Halsey was convinced to sail north, along with his main force of aircraft carriers and battleships, he left behind the so-called Taffy 3, a small force consisting of 6 escort carriers and 3 destroyers near that island of Samar. And it was there, on that day, that the Central Force operated, which Yamato was part of, under Admiral Takeo Kurita, who was previously aboard the cruiser Atago. And when the Atago was sunk, he then transferred his command post to the Yamato. And it's based on the actions of that day that I personally believe the presence of the Yamato at the Battle of Midway in June 1942 could indeed have changed the entire balance of the battle in favor of the Japanese. I explained that in another video if you're interested. But what happened on that day, October 24th? At 6:57 in the morning, the Yamato spotted its first target on the horizon. At 6:57, it opened fire, and with the first salvo of 460 millimeters at an incredible 31 kilometers away, it scored a direct hit on the escort carrier United States ship White Plains, striking the ship's boiler, causing it to immediately lose power and forcing it to crawl out of the combat area right away. The White Plains was not sunk for good, but the damage was so severe that the White Plains was never used in frontline missions again until the end of the war. At 7:30 in the morning, Admiral Kurita, there on the Yamato's bridge, observes through his binoculars an enemy ship on the horizon that he thinks is a cruiser, but in fact, it was a destroyer, the United States ship Johnston. And at that historic moment, Kurita orders a full broadside from the Yamato, that is, to open fire with all 3 main turrets synchronized on a single target. And from that first salvo, 3 shots hit the destroyer Johnston directly. The ship would still take more hits, but moments later, due to the intense damage caused by the Yamato, it simply breaks in 2 and sinks. But don't think that the Yamato was satisfied yet, because at 8:10 in the morning, it opens fire on a second American aircraft carrier, the United States ship Gambier Bay. It hits from 20 kilometers away. The first salvo lands a shell directly inside the hangar of the aircraft parking deck, exploding in the middle of the Gambier Bay. 10 minutes later, the Yamato scores another hit on the carrier, striking directly at the ship's engine room, which was below the waterline. And minutes later, the Yamato switches targets to the destroyer United States ship Hull and lands a direct hit on it, striking the last boiler the ship had running. At that moment, then, the Yamato has two targets smoking on the horizon, and the Hull, which is smaller, will sink at 8:50 in the morning. But exactly 17 minutes later, at 9:07 in the morning, the Gambier Bay will also go to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean due to battle damage caused by the Yamato's guns. Despite the Yamato's individual success in this battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a major disaster for the Imperial Japanese Navy, which loses numerous aircraft carriers and 3 battleships, including the Musashi itself, Yamato's sister ship. But the Yamato itself manages to escape the combat area and return to Japan, where on November 25th, Captain Kosaku Aruga takes command of the warship. He will be the last commander of the Yamato, while the ship underwent more minor system upgrades. On March 19th, an American task force attacked the Kure naval base, and the Yamato narrowly escaped being sunk. He managed to set out to sea, and right there, near Kure's own dock, he began to be heavily bombarded from the air. But its maneuverability ended up saving the Yamato from much more serious damage, and the ship remained basically intact. But things are really going to get very serious and desperate for Japan on April 1st, 1945, when the Americans begin their landing to conquer the island of Okinawa, just 500 kilometers from Japan itself. The importance of conquering Okinawa for the Americans was directly related to the future invasion of Japan itself. Since Okinawa was supposed to serve as a logistical base, its large supply warehouse would support the invasion of Japan. So, keeping Okinawa out of American hands was the #1 priority of the government at that time. And the prevailing desperation led the Navy's high command to design and approve Operation Tingo. In this operation, Yamato would be the head of the Special Surface Attack Force, essentially the largest kamikaze mission in history, in which Yamato would set sail loaded with ammunition and only enough fuel for the trip to Okinawa. After reaching the combat zone, Yamato was supposed to open fire, destroying and damaging as many enemy vessels as possible. And when its fuel was almost gone, it was supposed to approach the coast of Okinawa and run aground there, continuing to fight as a fixed gun battery until it was eventually completely annihilated by enemy forces. But the Japanese didn't realize that all their communications were being read by the Americans, and the American command already knew all about this. All of this planning, even before Yamato set sail for the combat area in Okinawa. By the way, Yamato set sail on April 6th, on the morning of April 6th, 1945, heading south towards Okinawa. But when it was passing through the Bungo Strait, which separates Japan's inland sea from the Pacific Ocean, it was spotted by 2 American submarines that were lying in wait there at the exit of the strait. And those submarines then passed the information to the American command over in Okinawa. That's when Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the American battleship force on the island, prepared 6 battleships to intercept the Yamato. But Admiral Nimitz, the overall commander of the Northern Pacific Operations Area, decided that the interception of the Yamato should be carried out by aircraft from the aircraft carriers of Admiral Mark Meecher's task force. Therefore, Spruance's battleships only formed a large protective barrier around the Okinawa combat area and did not actually face the Yamato at sea. Then on the morning of April 7th, just 24 hours after leaving port, the crew of the Yamato saw At 8:23 in the morning, the first two American seaplanes flying over the ship. These two seaplanes spent the entire rest of the morning flying over the Yamato, continuously passing information to the American fleet. And at 12:37, the first group of dive bombers and torpedo bombers approached the ship. A first torpedo hit the side of the Yamato, not causing serious damage to the structure, but creating a tremendous shockwave throughout the ship. And shortly after, 5 American bombs hit the battleship's deck, concentrating their damage in the anti-aircraft area and also destroying one of the secondary turrets, the one with 155 millimeters. Ending this first attack, the American torpedo bombers hit 2 torpedoes on the port side of the ship, that is, on its left side, causing the ship to start listing 6 degrees to port. At 1 o'clock, the second wave of American attacks reached the ship. This time, there were so many planes, dive bombers above and torpedo bombers below, right at the surface of the water, that Yamato's anti-aircraft guns were completely overwhelmed. There were more targets than gunners trying to shoot, so basically, the ship was defenseless. Even though Yamato's main 460mm batteries fired the famous beehive shells, which were basically swarms, they were essentially the biggest shotgun in history. It was an anti-aircraft fragmentation shell developed by the Japanese in the hope of eventually stopping an enemy air attack. But in fact, they caused very little damage to American aircraft. The American torpedo bombers hit 3 more torpedoes on the port side of the ship, and that caused the Yamato's list to port to reach over 10 degrees, also reducing the ship's speed. Then at 1:40 post-meridian, the third wave of American attacks arrived. This time, the dive bombers hit with 4 bombs, which basically wiped out the rest of the ship's anti-aircraft artillery. And several other planes also made strafing runs, which ended up killing, actually, all those gunners who were exposed there on the deck. Yamato takes 3 more torpedoes to starboard in this wave of attack, and these 3 torpedoes flood the ship's steering control room. This causes the Yamato to get stuck in a turn to starboard, a right turn. So you can imagine that the ship was tilted to the left, making an endless right turn. At this point, Yamato's situation was already completely hopeless. Then, at 2:02 post-meridian, Commander Aruga gives the order to abandon ship. To give you an idea of how much Yamato was listing to port, 3 minutes after that order, American torpedo bombers hit 3 more torpedoes on the starboard side of the ship, that is, the right side, the side that was on the inside of the turn. These 3 torpedoes were set to run about 6 meters below the surface and hit 6 meters below the surface. But the ship was so tilted, that these torpedoes ended up hitting the bottom of Yamato's hull, the very bottom of the ship's hull, which was quite exposed because of the tilt. At 14:23, the Yamato will finally roll over, turning and ending up belly up. And minutes later, 2 magazines that were located at the stern of the ship, at the rear part of the ship, will rupture in a violent explosion. This explosion then causes a gigantic, very tall, mushroom-shaped cloud, which is seen, according to some witnesses, even in the south of Kyushu Island, which is more than 200 kilometers away at that moment. When Yamato sinks, it will create a suction that will pull in many of these men, hundreds, maybe thousands of these survivors who are in the water, causing out of the original 3,233 crew members, 3,055 to be lost, resulting in only 277 survivors who are rescued from the sea by the Japanese destroyers that were accompanying Yamato. This, then, was the end of the largest battleship in human history and the completely unfortunate end of Operation Tengo. The wreckage of Yamato remained there at the bottom of the sea, completely lost for decades. Until, in 1984, an expedition managed to locate them at 340 meters deep in a region about 290 kilometers south of Kyushu. The Yamato is actually on the ocean floor, split in two. One separate part, which corresponds to about the front third of the ship, and another, which is the rear two-thirds, near it and turned upside down. Even so long after World War II, as I told you, the ship still maintains this special connection with the Japanese people, with the Japanese imagination. And in 2015, the Japanese Liberal Party even proposed starting a study to try to raise the wreckage of the Yamato, to salvage the wreckage of the Yamato and reconstruct the ship with the official proposal of recovering the remains of the crew members, which we know very well that very little is left of mortal remains after so many decades submerged at the bottom of the sea. But it would truly be an absolutely wonderful sight to see that ship completely restored there in a Japanese port today. Imagine that, a ship 263 meters long, 70,000 tons, the largest battleship in history, restored and turned into a museum. I would like to see that, but anyway, that project didn't lead to anything, at least not so far. And, as we know, in the year 2199, the Yamato will finally be recovered from the bottom of the Pacific and turned into a space battleship. But that's a topic for another time. Now tell me, did you already know the story of the battleship Yamato? Were you already aware of Yamato's combat record at the Battle of Leyte Gulf? Did you also want to see the Yamato rescued from the bottom of the Pacific and turned into a floating museum? Tell us in the comments below if you like this video, then share it with your friends too, and give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra to stay updated. I'll stop here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.